All right, so quick review, as I said, just to jog your memory. We talked last week about why the information revolution, what was it exactly? And I basically made the case to you that if there was one time and place that could be pinpointed, it would be probably around the year 1947, 1948, a few years before and after that, at places such as Bell Labs, motivated by the highly disciplining and concentrating external pressure, the survival pressure of World War II. That put a bunch of genius people in the same rooms and forced them to solve a lot of problems all at once. Okay, that was kind of what I think why there was something called the information revolution as we know it, as a kind of concentrated point in time where so much about information technology was advanced. Okay. And I made the case also that there is, in my view, if there's one sort of underlying thread that all of the kind of subsequent technological innovations that were spawned by the information revolution, if there's one thing that they kind of had in common that was most important, there was an underlying thread. It seems to me that it's the digital, the difference between digital and analog. Okay, and so I tried to kind of explain just technically, what is that difference, and I also alluded a little bit to kind of the philosophical implications. So that's what we talked about, and so then I also talked about this idea of technologically skill bias technological change, which is a well-documented kind of phenomenon in empirical social science research. But I also kind of argued that I think something like that has happened not just at the economic level in terms of income and income inequality, right? The basic idea, to jog your memory, of skill bias technological change is that certain technological advancements can increase the income of people with skills, but have no effect on the income of people with no skills, or even lead to declining wages for people with no skills. Okay, that's why it's called skill bias technological change, and that's one of the big explanations for why we've seen a lot of increasing inequality over the past several decades, and especially in the Western liberal countries such as the U.S. and the U.K. Okay, skill bias technological change. And basically, my argument, one of the key, the kind of basis for my larger kind of interpretation of the information revolution as a kind of politically significant world historical moment, it's not, my argument is not sophisticated or fancy. It's basically the same idea as skill bias technological change, but arguing that that same phenomenon probably applies to other aspects of culture. So it's not just a matter of people with more skills getting paid more, because of this new form of technology that they're better able to use than other types of people who don't have those skills. But I think you see a similar pattern in ethics, even, like how people think about how they should interact with each other. So basically, if you're really good at being a kind of exploitative, instrumental person, and you don't really care about people's feelings, and you don't really care about kind of deep, authentic interpersonal dialogue and things like this, like a substantively meaningful experiences that most of us find our lives to be valuable because of. If you're not that interested in that stuff, but you're really good at computers, you're really good at manipulating systems, and you're good at winning instrumental games, well, then with the new advances in information technology, you're going to be able to basically spend all day and night programming your computer to make millions of dollars, or be Jeff Bezos and design something like Amazon.com's incredibly sophisticated supply chain management, right? You're going to be able to do that hardcore, become a super powered billionaire or something. But if you're not into that kind of stuff, exploiting the environment to make profit, if you're not interested in that type of stuff, you're going to be relatively disempowered. Okay, so it seems to me that there are ethical and cultural implications in the same pattern, basically, as skill bias technological change. Skill bias technological change is just a specific finding in the formal economics literature that shows kind of the formal, demonstrable nature of this type of change, okay? So what I'm going to do in part of today's lecture is I'm going to give you some more examples of a similar type of forms of kind of cultural inequality, or ethical inequality, we can even think of it as, that gets opened up and kind of exacerbated by these developments of the technological, by the information revolution, okay? I'm going to try to put some meat on the bones of that argument, instead of just, it's been an abstract idea that I've referred to a few times. I'm going to try to put some meat on the bones of it today. Right. And that basically is basically what I would call my kind of macro political theory of the information revolution, because basically I think when you take this kind of high level view of things and you have a few of these basic concepts that we've talked about, basically the basic idea about how technology interacts with different levels of intelligence differently, right? And even different personality traits. If we have time, I might, at some point, either today or in a future lecture, talk a little bit about personality traits, because just like intelligence is differently distributed across, the human species, we do have different levels of intelligence, something I've talked about. We also have different personality traits, and that is and they are largely genetic, okay? And so that affects how we respond to the same changes, all right? I'll say a little bit more about that when we get to some of the more concrete examples of, what I call kind of, ethically biased cultural change, or I'm sorry, ethically biased technological change, okay, or skill-biased cultural change. You think about it in either way. All right. So briefly, we looked at this graph of the information revolution. Most of the kind of innovations in technological information processing that have ever occurred in human history have occurred in the past 100 years, right? And most of those have happened in the past few decades. So that's a concrete way of thinking about it. We looked at this graph that shows, the incredibly concentrated nature of recent technological innovations compared to most of history, in which it's much more spread out. Right. This is where I talked about, the series of discoveries and inventions that came really tightly clustered around the years of 1948 because of the war effort, and places like Bell Labs. I should also mention, places like Bletchley Park, of course, in the UK. People like Alan Turing were also kind of in the same ballpark, okay, of kind of clusters of innovations that would lead to things like computers, of course. Okay. And then I talked a little bit about digitalism. We went over the difference between analog and digital, some of the formal differences. I tried to kind of explain to you how analog is involved. What's involved with analog, technology is a certain kind of infinite resolution signal. Okay, and this was one of the things I wasn't sure if it came out quite well, but I read more about it and thought more about it and even wrote some more about it. And one of the things that I kind of became more clear to me as I was thinking about it, which I maybe didn't quite get across last time, is that. So an analog signal has a theoretically infinite resolution, all right? Like that's this first one here. So when I vibrate my vocal cords and project, changes in the air pressure, and those enter your ears, right? And you're processing those fluctuations in the air pressure. That's basically an analogical process. There's physical movements that are happening, okay? And what I meant by infinite resolution is that, so take the pitch of my voice, for instance, as you're listening to it. Like your ear can only detect certain, levels of change. You're not able to, have an infinitely fine-grained sense of the pitch of my voice. But theoretically, the pitch of my voice, it does not have a kind of predetermined or pre-limited resolution. It potentially could be anywhere on the real number line. Like let's say you have a number, right, for my pitch from 1 to 10 or whatever. That's just a totally arbitrary scale. Let's say, pitch could be on a scale from 1 to 10. Well, the pitch of my voice is not just on a scale of 1 to 10. It theoretically could be, it could take the value of 2.2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, 6, 8, 8, 8. Do you see what I'm saying? The real number line is infinite because there's any number of decimal values, okay? So the pitch of my voice at any particular time, any kind of analog signal has this feature of being a continuous variable, in other words, for those of you who are statistically inclined. Okay, so when you are processing my voice, or you're processing a vinyl record or whatever it might be, an analog signal, you're not perceiving an infinite richness because you have limited capacities. We all have limited capacities by virtue of the physical apparatus that we're using. But the signal, when you're receiving an analog signal, that signal has a theoretically infinite range in some sense because there are infinite numbers of decimal points, right? So that's the key thing that I wasn't quite sure that I got that across. But the point is that when you're listening to an analog signal or receiving an analog signal at any kind, it doesn't just have to be listening. It's an encounter with the infinite. That's basically what I was trying to get across. your ability to receive it is going to be limited. But you're encountering something that is infinite. And I think there's something almost cosmically significant about that. Because as human beings, the truth of the matter of our life on this planet, the nature of our actual human being, is that we are limited creatures. We're finite creatures. Our ears can only hear certain ranges. Of course, we're limited. But we, as human beings, are engaging with the infinite. I mean, if you look out into outer space, right, like we're floating on a rock in the middle of who knows where, and we can only travel out so far. We only know, so much about our, place in the universe. Our ability to comprehend things is limited. But there is a kind of infinite vastness in which we are actually embedded. The infinity of the universe or whatever is beyond the farthest point that we can measure. We are embedded in infinity. That is part of our authentic reality of human beings. Okay, we have to have a certain interchange or exchange with the infinity that we are not able to match up to or meet completely. And the experience of that gap between our own finitude and the infinity of the actual universe or being or whatever you want to call it, that kind of contact with the outside that's always exceeding our capacities. That is, I would argue, it's a kind of defining feature of what it means to be human, okay? And so if you go back to what I was saying in the earlier lectures about what exactly substantive rationality is, things like what exactly is substantive communication, well, it's basically truth for truth's sake. There are, we have strong, I think, needs and almost physiological kind of features in our most basic mental and physical functioning, kind of embedded into our nervous system. We have need for having a correct kind of understanding of who we are and where we are. Okay, so the reason the reason I went on this kind of one of the reasons I should say I went on to this kind of explication of what exactly analog is because it represents a kind of technical version of a kind of substantively rational reality, which is our embeddedness in infinity and our necessary kind of obligation to be who that is kind of imposed on us as a feature of who we are as limited creatures, to basically be embedded in infinity and to engage with infinity and to be engaged in these kinds of vastnesses that exceed our capacities and yet are real. Okay, and what happens with the digital is basically the digital is a kind of technological or instrumental way of sealing off that challenge, of sealing off that kind of overwhelming vastness of the infinity that we are truly and empirically embedded in. The digital is a kind of reduction of that contact with infinity that we're embedded in into this kind of more controllable, discrete separation and reduction of that infinity into more manageable quantities. That, I think, is the difference between a discrete variable and a continuous variable. Continuous variables are infinite, theoretically. Discrete variables are not infinite. They're finite, just like we are. So what happens with digital processing, it seems like such a subtle difference, right? These curves seem only so subtly different. They're basically the same shape. What's the big deal? Well, the difference is the difference between infinity and something that's not infinity. Okay, that's like it's a subtle difference, but it's a major difference. And so the reason that that's so important is because baked into this distinction, I think that there are serious kind of philosophical and kind of existential implications, basically. Because what we do when we fraction off the infinite into this kind of discrete, reduced alternative, we're able to create from there an entire new world. That's what cyberspace is. Things like virtual reality, all of these kinds of tendencies in contemporary kind of technoculture. It is the capacity to basically create worlds within our world that in almost every way are, as information processing gets increasingly powerful, those fake worlds that we create digitally are almost in every way, they approach as real as the real world, right? As data processing gets better, virtual reality is soon going to be, we are really soon going to be in a place where you can genuinely have a completely different life that's fabricated within a virtual reality system. And you put on goggles and you put on a kind of bodysuit or whatever, and you can be in one room and walk around dozens of people and communities and have relationships with virtual people who are completely fabricated out of digital, out of zeros and ones, all composed of zeros and ones. And yet it completely encompasses your kind of, your physical experience. And you can experience it almost as if in almost every way, it's about, equivalent to the experiences you have with real people, right now or whatever. Virtual reality is rapidly going there. Okay, I mean, in some sense, it's already there. If you've ever, I've never worn any of these like really sophisticated kind of VR headsets, but from what I've read and from what I've heard, it's quite uncanny, and it's only going to get more and more intense. You also see it with things like Second Life, and like video, like all-consuming video games, where people have entire other lifestyles and can spend all day on their computer game, quite as a replacement for their own life. Okay, so you see these things already. It's only going to get more and more. Okay, now why? So this is why this is so important. This is what's at stake. Because what I'm kind of trying to say is that there is a serious and demonstrable, almost mathematically demonstrable difference between our digital creations and our non-digital realities. Okay, and this is kind of, to a lot of people, this is kind of an old-fashioned idea. Like a lot of people today, kind of postmodern types of people, generally want to think, oh well, virtual reality, whatever, that's where the world is going. It's just the same as regular reality. And, you're kind of a conservative, grandpa if you want to kind of harken back to the good old days of real communication and things like this. To a lot of people, this sounds like kind of conservative or whatever. But no, I think that what we're talking about here, and the whole reason I'm trying to, I went over this, and now I'm kind of trying to kind of really ram it home, is that there is something that is irrevocably lost or just reduced in that subtle change from the infinite of analog signaling to digital signaling. Okay, and it is basically our experience with our contact with the infinite outside. That's at least my working hypothesis. Okay, I think we might see in the later slides today how that actually plays out in the deterioration of our actual human experiences. Okay, and why I think that's not just a philosophical issue. Okay, since we're just reviewing, I can't get too distracted. I think that I hope that gets it across better than last time. I feel like it does. We talked about all of the specific implications, such as the decreasing cost in the production, storing, and sharing of information. How digital copies do not add noise in each copy as analog does. We talked about compression and the tendency for electronic miniaturization, which digital technology made possible. We talked about technological convergence, the notion of all these different types of media, channels or platforms such as TV and radio, which once upon a time had their own kind of physical infrastructure, are now with the digital, because of the digital, I think, at least as far as I can tell, they're all kind of converging into one platform composed of nothing but zeros and ones, the digital or cyberspace, okay? Also, the integration of communication and computation. That the tools we use for computing things are also the same tools we use for communicating things. And I just went over this, the reduction of continuous or infinite variation to discrete variation. Okay, great. We talked about skill-wise technological change, which, as I said, is a kind of well-documented kind of tendency in economics. It's debated, like everything is in serious social science. But I kind of went over the basic logic as a model for some of the other types of changes that we'll talk about. Basically, the rationale is that economic inequality, wage inequality in particular, appears to track pretty closely the introduction of the microcomputer. Okay, that's especially the argument of the piece by Katz, 1999. Okay, so that's some kind of empirical kind of support for the idea that inequality is being driven by information technological advances. All right. Other data points are such as the fact that you see high-skill, high-education workers more likely to use computers on the job. Okay, I think it's a pretty intuitive idea. Great. So here's where the larger ideas that I'm kind of interested in developing come into play. Basically, and I've already kind of alluded to this, so I won't spend too much time on it, but basically, in a nutshell, the reason I spent all of these past few weeks outlining, what exactly is intelligence? What exactly is rationality? What is the difference between instrumental rationality and substantive rationality? And these notions of positive feedback and, the positive feedbacks between technological change and economic growth. Modernity as an explosive process. The reason that I've kind of developed all these ideas piece by piece over the past few weeks is to now get us to a point where we can try and understand or make some educated guesses as to the effects of something like a massive explosion of information technology or information processing power, let's say. Okay, and so in a nutshell, I think that what happens with the information revolution, in other words, around the 1950s, or let's just say the middle of the 20th century, in part because of the World War II effort, you see a particularly powerful kind of bump or shock, let's say, increase in the positive feedbacks that characterize the relationships between intelligence, capital, and technology. Okay, so I've already kind of explained in previous weeks how these things are related and how they feed each other, right? How there's a certain kind of isomorphism, if you will, between these things. So that you should already have a kind of conceptual sense of that. What I'm now basically saying is that I think around the middle of the 20th century, some discoveries were made, some engineering advances were made, and this was all kind of crystallized by this substantial kind of survival pressure, right? That is World War II and the threat of national destruction, right? It made all the smart people figure out a bunch of shit, in other words, pretty quickly. That is what I think the information revolution is. So now we're in a place to basically make some predictions about how that would affect the social fabric, okay? And as I kind of alluded to last week, most of the kinds of patterns that I'm kind of going to try to identify that I believe have happened as somewhat, partially as a result of changes in information technology. Most of them are not very controversial. They're often already well identified trends, but they're separated in terms of academic disciplines, right? So I draw widely on economics for the skill-wise technological change. I'm going to draw on political science for some trends that have to do with media consumption, but are basically parallel to skill-wise technological change. And I have to draw on all these different fields of scholars who are not necessarily talking with each other, because generally scholars, don't talk with each other. They drill down deep into their particular discipline. So my point is, I'm making kind of fairly ambitious, provocative claims, but they're not. They're all of them are based on relatively straightforward, well-documented patterns within particular disciplines. Okay. In particular, skill-biased ethical change in favor of instrumentalism. In other words, people with exploitative kind of ethical orientations, people who are cool with exploiting and don't feel that compassionate, for instance, are going to be kind of supercharged by the information revolution, whereas people who are really into compassion are not similarly kind of supercharged. So this is right. So that's kind of where things like personality also come into play here, because some people are more compassionate than others. It's actually a personality trait. The actual trait is called agreeableness. And I don't know how many of you know this, but things like the personality traits such as agreeableness, a subset of which is compassion. It's part of it is genetic. So people have fundamentally different kind of biological starting points for things like compassion. And so some people have very little of it. Some people don't really care about how other people feel. So basically what I'm getting at is what this idea of skill-biased ethical change, or ethically biased technological change, whatever you want to call it, is that certain types of people, certain types of behaviors were promoted and benefited and kind of supercharged by the information revolution, whereas others were not, such as compassion. And I think that start to think about the implications of that, I think it can help to explain a lot of things, and I'm going to try to show that. But also unequally distributed social learning, right? So we'll talk about some examples of that. Like if you're really into learning about how the world works, the World Wide Web, for instance, is an incredible boon to that, right? You can spend all day just reading Wikipedia articles, getting super smart, reading the news, getting a super sophisticated understanding of how the world works, if you're really into that. And if you have the kind of super IQ and conscientiousness to do that. But if you're not into that, you can also watch Netflix all day as an alternative, right? You can actually kind of let yourself get even more and more kind of, comfortable in your own way. But what's going to happen in the long run? What's going to be the political and economic implications of that? Well, the world is going to start to be run by people who don't watch Netflix that much, right? So that's kind of what I mean by unequally distributed social learning. Also, I think that like people's tendency to actually kind of realize what's going on with it, because remember, one of the reasons we talk about kind of techonomic acceleration is to really stress the fact that all of these changes, they're happening for the first time. Like the human species has never seen so much change so rapidly. Okay, so we have monkey brains like that are not designed for being able to gauge like super complicated and rapid changes in the complex kind of civilizational environment that we're embedded in. Like our brains are designed for us to like not get eaten by lions and snakes. Like that's what we have, this like mental machinery that was built over millions of years for like very specific and relatively quite limited purposes, like not being able to see a snake in the grass and not getting bit and killed by a poisonous snake. Like our entire visual system, for instance, like the entire parts of our brain, and most of our brain actually goes to visual processing. It's a super data intensive and calorically demanding part of like our basic mental functioning is just vision and processing all of these signals that we're getting from into our eyeballs. Okay, do you know how we got that? We got it because of snakes. Literally, our vision evolved in large part to be able to identify snakes in the grass, like a green snake in the grass that can kill you. You need to be able to see that before it bites you, right? That's why we have vision in large part, and things like this. Also things like ripe fruit, right? The ability to identify like a ripe red apple. Apples co-evolved with our senses of vision. Okay, right? So my point here, this little kind of historical aside, is that we have a certain mental machinery that is evolved over millions of years for relatively specific tasks, in which over this large course of human history, there's almost no technological change. Okay, it's like a million years, nothing changes. All of a sudden, someone comes up with like the idea of a spear. Okay, great. Now we can hunt with spears, and then it's like a million years until the next thing, right? So like super slow technological change. Nothing about our mental machinery as it has evolved over the millions of years equips us for being able to understand and comprehend massive changes in a complex social system such as modern global capitalism, and to be able to pay attention and to understand what those changes are, and to adapt and to update our behaviors, to update our model of the world and how we interact with it based on this kind of paying attention to massively complex and rapid technological change. We're just fundamentally ill-equipped for dealing with it when we have these monkey brains that are basically dedicated to not being able to identify a snake in the grass or identify a ripe fruit. Okay. So that's what I mean by unequally distributed social learning: the ability to actually like update your model of the world and comprehend these changes and respond to them intelligently. Some people are going to be better at that than others, and some people are going to do it sooner than others. Okay, I'm going to tell this story in kind of with actual human beings and groups of people in just a minute. Right, and then finally things like geographical compression and segregation, selection effects. The information revolution allows people to basically choose their own groups with greater efficiency. Right, so you see that in a very strong way today with web culture. Right. You can find your people no matter where you are. How you define the group you want to be a part of, you can define with ever increasingly precise resolution. That's what information technology basically allows people to do. And you see it even with things like geographical movements. Like you can like use Google to shop or where in the world do you want to live? Like where's the ideal city for you to live? You can learn this through things like through information technology, and that kind of increasingly sophisticated selection effects, I would argue, is something that you see generally with information technology. You see it also with partisan sorting, like people can choose to hang out with people who agree with them, right? Okay. Geographical compression and segregation, that's very similar. By that I mean, the ability, like nearly real-time command, communication and command. So imagine like things like Amazon's supply chain management. It's kind of like the global, megalithic kind of global system that functions as like its own, almost like its own autonomous unit in real time, okay, across the globe. All right, great. So that was all basically a recap. I know I took the first half to do it, but I think that was worth it. Also because I brought in, I repeated some of the things I said last time, but I think I was a little bit more clear, and I also brought in some different context and some additional information, which I think made my recap just now worthwhile. And I think it made it much better and kind of rounded it out a bit. So with that, what we'll do next is I'm going to try to actually tell you the story of how the world changed, I think, from 1950 to today, basically, in a nutshell. I'm going to give you kind of the main patterns in terms of media consumption, in terms of protest behavior, in terms of ideological change. Like, has the world become more left-wing or more right-wing? People on the left think the world has become more right-wing, but people on the right think the world has become more left-wing. I'm going to try to tell you this story as I see it, and I'm going to try to sort of solve these puzzles, basically, in a nutshell, as best as I can, according to this theory. I think that basically everything I've been working up to now allows us to give a kind of high-level, I think pretty compelling and convincing explication of all of these puzzles in one kind of fell swoop, or at least that's going to be my attempt as soon as we get back from a little break. Yeah, rest your brains for a little bit. Why don't you just I think 5 minutes is enough. 10 minutes feels a little bit too long. Take 5 minutes just to chill, stretch your legs, use the loo, get some water. Okay, so moving forward. Looking at the cultural and political changes that occurred in the aftermath of the information revolution. Obviously, lots of things happened. But what we're always looking for is a kind of high-level, parsimonious explanation that can make sense of a lot of confusing things, right? So, obviously, you can't say that everything that happened since the 1950s is explained by the information revolution. That would be stupid and naive, and that's not going to be my argument at all. But I am going to make a pretty ambitious argument that a bunch of peculiar things have happened in a fairly general way across many countries at the same time, and that they might seem separate, but actually, if you think about them together as a kind of high-level civilizational kind of set of consequences from what is a basically high-level civilizational shift in the kind of technological nature of society, you can actually come up with a pretty sophisticated and pretty simple, but I think empirically quite and theoretically quite plausible accounting of a whole bunch of things that have happened, all right? So to do this, I need to kind of, I'm going to tell you basically a kind of historical story, kind of trying to put into almost a narrative form the theoretical ideas that I've built up to this point, okay? So to do that, I need to kind of give you a good sense of the history, okay? Because I don't know how much of you know the basic history of certain things, okay? So broadly, we can say that around the 1950s and 1960s were what some people call the golden age of broadcasting, kind of old-fashioned television, right? So imagine, like a black and white television, right? Tiny little guy with like a big, tiny screen, right? But like a big back end, old school. In the 50s or 60s, the golden age of broadcasting is sometimes thought of, or is kind of emblematically represented by, the nighttime news, by the same old anchorman you see every night around 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. You watch over dinner with your family that has a white picket fence around its little ideal nuclear 1950s family home, right? This is kind of the image of the golden age of broadcasting, okay? So here, let's jump forward a little bit to the next slide. If you look at how these things kind of diffuse over time, you see in the 1950s and 1960s, you have radio, television, you have radio and telephone, pretty well diffused. This is of the United States, by the way. Radio and television and telephone are pretty diffused. TV really only starts to get popular from the 1950s, but through the 1950s, it's kind of skyrockets in popularity. So by the end of the 1950s, most people have a TV, okay? And from this time, from let's say roughly the 1950s to the 1960s, you see that the next kind of major change on this front is cable television. We're going to talk a little bit about why cable television is so different. It had really important effects. To foreshadow, it's because it gave people more choice. And when people can choose what to watch, inequalities start to open up, okay? But the point is that from around 1950 to 1960s, you have radio, telephone, and TV widely disseminated. Most people have access to them. And at this time, we call the 50s and 60s the golden age of broadcasting, in large part because if there's one kind of key defining feature of this period, it's that most people who watch TV were watching the same thing. Okay, there were only a few channels, and for any given hour, there was usually like only one thing that was really of interest, right? So like the nightly news, for instance, was a relatively centralized and commonly shared thing, okay? So in the 1950s and 1960s, most people had the same reference points for kind of generally what was going on in society. It was the nightly newsman who kind of told everyone basically more or less the same thing. Now, people disagreed about how society should be, whether a certain change in society was good or whether it was bad. There's always been ideological, divisions, of course. But in the 1950s and 1960s, more or less, people had a similar image of at least what the world was, at least what the news was. People had more or less the same reference point, okay? That's really crucial. So we're going to see why, but just keep that in mind. Obviously today, that's not at all the case. On the internet, people, based on the news that you receive on the internet, based on your Facebook news feed, based on who you follow on Twitter, whatever it might be, you're literally not in the same world as other people who are getting totally different news feeds and different information sources. It's not just that you disagree ideologically today. It's that the most basic reference points for what the world even is different depending on different ideological groupings today, okay? In the 1950s and 60s, that was not the case yet. At least relatively not. There was this shared reference point. Okay, that's really important. From the 1950s to the early 1970s, you also saw periods, these were generally periods of a lot of upheaval, like in terms of political and social contestation, let's say. There was a lot of class, race, and gender conflict, and for the most part, I'm talking about, for this subpoint, I'm talking about kind of the wealthy countries of the global north, like the U.S. and Western Europe. I'm going to talk in just a minute about the global south, which also saw upheaval in the same time, but a different type of upheaval. In countries such as the U.S., UK, most of Western Europe, there were extremely militant, kind of radical democratic protest movements. In the U.S., obviously the civil rights movement is the most famous, which happened, kind of began around the 1950s, really kind of picked up speed around the 1950s, and then especially in the 1960s. Okay. So mass mobilization of black folks and anti-racist white folks also. Student movements were very big, especially in the 60s, in France and the US, in Mexico, and many countries. Especially the late 60s, there was a lot of young people in particular going crazy in protest against capitalism, against all kind of status quo institutions, about the very nature of modern life. It's often called the New Left, in distinction from the Old Left, which was kind of, the old school kind of trade unionist, old man type of image of the Old Left, is replaced by students, feminists, all these new types of people coming onto the scene and saying, no, we want democracy also, but we maybe don't even want to be in your trade union. We want liberty. We want to have fun. We want a meaningful life. We're against capitalism because it's boring. This sort of energy, a lot is kind of like flowering in the 1960s in particular. Okay. Second wave feminism, of course, is in the 1970s. Okay, so you see that in countries such as Italy, there was substantial left-wing terrorism. Even there was a little bit in the U.S. things like the Weather Underground, right? There were some actual kind of left-wing anti-capitalist types of bombings and stuff like that by groups such as the Weather Underground. In Italy, throughout the 70s, there was like a massive kind of social, like society-wide kind of terrorism crisis in some sense. From kind of radical left-wing groups and at war basically with the state. Okay, it was very severe in Italy. My point is, okay, I'm painting a picture of the kinds of things that you're seeing, the kinds of social unrest and upheaval that you're seeing across the U.S. and Western Europe in the 1960s and 1960s especially. Then in the 1970s, obviously different countries have slightly different experiences, different timings. But broadly, we can say from the 1950s and 1970s, there's a lot of upheaval. In the global south, you're seeing things like decolonization and national liberation struggles, right? So broadly speaking, in the 1950s and 1960s, like Africa in particular is like totally kicking off. Middle East, totally kicking off. Basically, these are countries that have more or less been, subject to colonialism and imperialism by Western powers for quite a long time. In the 1950s and 60s, there's a big wave of countries in the global south that say, no more, not anymore, we're kicking you out, and we want national liberation, we want democracy, we want socialism. Often the national liberation movements in the global south in the 50s and 60s were often, there's a high correlation between national liberation movements and socialism, or drives for socialism, socialist rhetoric. A lot of the nationalist liberation movements were basically socialist in nature, okay? Also, at this time in the 1950s and 1970s, you see another type of democratic tendency in the wage compression. Remember, I talked about this a little bit before, but basically, for a few reasons, World War I, World War II being one of them, the period up until about the early 1970s was a time of relatively profound and significant wage equality, relatively, okay? So that had a lot of, and also keep in mind, at least in the U.S., I believe, I know less about other countries, but I know in the U.S. at least, the 60s were also a time of economic growth, okay? So things were relatively, income inequality at least was relatively not so unequal. It was still some money inequality, but it was relatively compressed in historical terms. Inequality was not that bad, and there was growth. So there was people were doing well, right? That's the time of the iconic kind of 1950s bourgeois family with a big house and a big yard and a white picket fence and a car, okay? That was actually fairly, in the 1950s and 60s, factory workers, for instance, could live like that, have a nice home with a decent family and, a pretty comfortable life. A factory worker in a trade union could have a pretty decent life in the 1950s and 60s, okay? Things were getting rapidly better for lots of people, in other words, and throughout this time. And that was a big part of why there was a lot of kind of democratic tendencies and kind of, social protest and radical forms of social change and activism, right? Okay, so that's the picture broadly. Obviously, there's lots of exceptions, super complex. This is a kind of cartoonish history I'm telling you, obviously, but I think it broadly it does the trick, okay? From the mid to late 1970s, you see the emergence of what a lot of people would call a right-wing reaction, often termed quote-unquote neoliberalism. It's a word that's bandied about a lot nowadays. You've probably heard that at least sometime in your life. Neoliberalism is generally a term used by left-wing folks to describe the right-wing, what is seen as a right-wing kind of economic reaction beginning in the mid to late 1970s, okay? Most specifically kind of emblematically represented by Reagan, who's elected in the United States in 1980, and Thatcher, of course, in this country, who's elected in 1979, okay? These are kind of the two of the most famous kind of indicators or faces, if you will, of what is called neoliberalism, okay? So I'm gonna show you some data actually on kind of what exactly neoliberalism entailed. But basically, you can basically think of it as a cluster of a cluster of economic reform policies that were basically pursued by a number of politicians in a number of countries around the late 70s and early 80s. Okay, so Thatcher and Reagan are kind of the most famous representatives of neoliberalism and this kind of turn to kind of right-wing economic policies. But it's kind of more generally a kind of semi-global kind of trend that happens. A lot of countries kind of follow follow that model. Okay, so that's why it's kind of called neoliberalism, as a kind of semi-global type of phenomenon, actually. All right. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about what it was, but in a nutshell, it's basically seen as right-wing people, especially wealthy elites, kind of deciding that all this chaos of the 1960s has to end, and there's too much equality, there's too much democracy, and we elites have to figure out a way to kind of get this under control, protect our assets, and also, there were also genuine disagreements about, the best way to run an economy, okay? So that's that. But what's also interesting, though, and this is one of the things that I think is so fascinating, and no one's really solved. I mean, I'm not familiar of anyone who has a very good explanation of this, any scholar or anyone really. The very paradoxical fact that, according to left-wing folks, since the 1980s, countries around the world have shifted towards greater economic conservatism, more brutal kinds of capitalism, dismantling the welfare state, things like that. That's kind of the left-wing story, that many countries have kind of shifted to the right economically. That's what neoliberalism is in the left-wing kind of narrative. But at the same time, in other ways, our countries, a lot of countries have become more socially liberal, or socially progressive, if you will, over the same time period. Okay, so if you look at data, for instance, on things like racism, for instance, or attitudes towards sexuality, right, homosexuality in particular, from the 1950s to today, people in countries such as the U.S. and the U.K. Have become gradually and significantly and steadily more supportive and open-minded towards all different kinds of things, such as different racial groups, different sexual orientations, all kinds of things like that. Okay, so and that's pretty clear. The data is quite clear on that. Obviously, there are still some racists. There's still some sexists, for sure. But the actual number of people who believe that different people have different worth based on their race or their sex or their gender or their sexual orientation, the number of people who actually think that has been significantly decreasing steadily, gradually, and sustainably, okay, since the 1950s, all right? So to the point that in the US and the UK, if you look at the data in the US, which I'm more familiar with, the number of people who are actually racists or sexists is almost certainly less now than it's ever been. I think that's a pretty fair thing to say. And that happened quite rapidly in historical terms. That happened quite rapidly from about the 1950s. In the time of segregation in the U.S., there were lots of properly racist attitudes, and people actually had totally ridiculous, incorrect, empirically incorrect, and ethically horrible notions about race and different, the different worthiness of different types of groups of people. That stuff was significantly. It was significantly reduced, okay, over the past several decades. So in one way, since the 1980s, our countries such as the U.S. and UK and much of Western Europe have become more economically conservative in policy, but they have also become more socially liberal, also in practice. All right, so there's something very screwy going on there, okay, and basically, depending on whether you're on the left or the right, you kind of tell that story differently, and you see that story differently. You see it with very different lenses. But what I'm going to try, I think, everything I've been kind of talking about so far is going to give us a way of understanding how maybe both of these things happen at the same time. In other words, what I think is kind of going on is there's a certain sort of division of labor in kind of collective deception. And so both the left and the right, in the face of kind of completely baffling forms of rapid techno-economic acceleration, they sort of burrow down into their own particular worldview. They interpret all of the changes that come down the pike in line with their, highly limited and fairly brittle set of ideological assumptions, and they just basically focus on those particular assumptions. They can only see things through those particular lenses. And so that's why, if you ask the average leftist to kind of describe the world, they'll say something like, oh, capitalism has never been more brutal. We live in this kind of neoliberal, embedded in these kind of neoliberal tendencies where the welfare state is being dismantled. And also racism is everyone's racist, and white supremacy is on the rise, and rape culture and sexism. And there is this kind of tendency for people on the left to see more and more of the things that they're most opposed to. And that makes sense psychologically, because if you're opposed to things, you're on the lookout for them. Your brain is attuned to them. And in many ways, that can be a good thing, to be highly alert to bad things, even if they're relatively historically on the decline. Okay? But that's the very particular kind of left-wing set of assumptions and way that's kind of the left-wing set of eyeglasses, right? But it's, typical left-wing attitude towards things today is historically quite skewed. Like people on the left generally, I know people who genuinely think that right now, racism and white supremacy are increasing, and it's almost certainly not increasing. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm saying I totally agree. We should be on guard to these things. We should be concerned about these things. We should be vocally anti-racist and oppose white supremacy wherever you see it. Right? I'm totally sympathetic to that. What I'm talking about though is empirically skewed models of historical change. Right? So people, because they feel emotionally opposed to something, can have, for that reason, fundamentally incorrect interpretations of the history. Okay, that's all I'm really getting at. And on the right-wing side, you see the same thing. So on the right, people on the right think that the world has become increasingly taken over by leftists. Okay, the idea on the right is that alternative sexualities, all kinds of liberal dissoluteness, laziness, entitlement, that these things have kind of plagued the youth in particular, that no one wants to work hard anymore, no one wants to fight for the country anymore, no one wants to defend their homeland anymore, right? Because of these precisely because in many ways socially the world has become more liberal and more open-minded. Right-wing people point to that, and they think everything is going down the tubes because it's becoming too left-wing. Okay. Meanwhile, they are kind of in denial, and they have a kind of skewed, kind of historical perception of how brutal capitalism has become, and how kind of unleashed and unconstrained kind of economic realities, competitive realities have become as kind of the welfare state has been kind of dismantled, or is gradually being dismantled. Whether that's by human beings and their agency, or whether that is itself a kind of outcome of kind of techno-economic changes that are beyond our control. That's something we can talk about later, but the point is, okay, right, so I think I have a kind of explanation for why the left wing sees things this way and the right wing sees things their way. Okay, so let's move on with the story a little bit. So typically, democratic tendencies lead to policies which seek to socialize the market. So there's this basic kind of opposition or trade-off between democracy and capitalism, I think it's fair to say. All right. And as I just described, the 50s to 70s were a time of wage compression and economic growth. So pretty widely, pretty relatively equally distributed economic growth. You have countries in the global south taking charge of themselves, kicking out the colonialists, electing their own leaders. Okay. So generally, for the most part, where you see democracy increase, you see tendencies towards socialism, basically, for the most part. Kind of anti-market types of attitudes, okay? And in the 1950s and 70s, there are a bunch of pretty significant efforts to kind of democratically kind of control capitalism, or potentially even overthrow capitalism. You got to remember in the 50s and 70s, for most of the 20th century, socialism was a very live idea. People believed, a lot of people, and especially because of the Russian Revolution, a lot of people believed that capitalism was on its way out, that socialism was going to fundamentally create a totally new world. Substantial numbers of people thought socialism was going to be a new type of society just around the corner. A lot of people thought that, okay, very seriously. So in the 50s and 70s, you see lots of examples of, socialist revolutions, basically, especially in the global south, when you have nationalist movements, kicking out the colonialists and taking power. Often they tried to implement kind of socialist tendencies. So one example would be Arbenz in Guatemala in 1950. Another example, to change it to a totally different region, would be Mossadegh in Iran in 1951. Tried to kick out the British, especially the oil interests, and nationalize the British oil was basically dominating Iran, making lots of money off of Iranian oil in a basically kind of colonialist framework. And Mossadegh was the populist democratic leader who was like, no, we got to kick out BP, we got to keep this oil to ourselves, and we should have national independence and democracy. And he was largely, he had a very kind of socialist kind of orientation. We need to use this oil money to give everyone a good life and make our citizens happy and well off, and that kind of socialist, kind of anti-capitalist, kind of implicitly anti-capitalist, kind of democratic populist tendency. Okay, he was basically assassinated by the CIA. And neoliberalism names the marked and widespread intensification of capitalism at the cost of democracy since the mid-1970s. I kind of already said that. But basically, when these types of, I could give lots of other examples, not just of Mossadegh and also people like, Allende in Chile, for instance. I thought I had a slide I can use up here somewhere. In Chile, Allende is an especially interesting case because they actually tried to use, remember the stuff I was talking about with cybernetics and positive feedback and this kind of whole way of thinking about things? They actually tried to use that philosophy of cybernetics to implement like a socialist economy. It was one of the more interesting experiments that was attempted in this kind of period of democratic populism from the 50s to 70s. This was in the early 70s. Allende in Chile implemented a computer system that was basically going to. He actually hired people that were actual cybernetic scientists at the time. People like Stafford Beer is what was one of the names of the people who were kind of enlisted to do this. Allende wanted to make like a big computer system that would basically be able to measure what every kind of city in the country needed. And through this kind of leveraging information technology, they would be able to have a kind of computerized socialist computer system, basically that would basically be able to kind of replace the market as the technology for deciding what resources should be put in different places, right? Very fascinating experiment. Didn't really work out so well, but of course lefties blame that on Pinochet being installed in power after Allende was overthrown basically by a right-wing reaction, which brings us to what people call neoliberalism. So not just with Thatcher and Reagan in the wealthy liberal countries, but also in the global South. There were a lot of examples of radical right-wing reaction. So in Chile, for instance, Pinochet was basically a fascist kind of dictator. There was a coup, overthrew Allende. Thatcher, Reagan. There are lots of other examples. Basically, in the late 70s and 80s, you see a few things like this. A kind of generalized shift towards a kind of right-wing, especially economic philosophy, okay? But there were still, things like desegregation. There was still a kind of general liberalization of social attitudes. But there were all these kind of fairly radical right-wing retrenchments. Okay, so what did this actually look like? Here, let's look at some data. So this data is from David Harvey's book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, if you're interested in, this particular historical change that people call neoliberalism. This is kind of one of the basic required reading that's often assigned for this sort of topic. David Harvey's book. It's a pretty slim volume. It's just a little history of what people mean by neoliberalism. But there's some good data in there. So here are some graphs. If you look at, this is in the United States, if you look at real wages and productivity, from the 60s to about the early 1980s, productivity is increasing and wages are increasing. Okay, average wages. All right, that's what I was saying. Relatively, there's wage compression and there's economic growth. In the 1980s, those two things start to split, though. You see real wages start to decrease, even though productivity is increasing. Okay. You now have a sense of why this might be. In large part, this is, I think, what you can read behind the lines of this graph is skill bias technological change, for instance, would be one explanation for why you see this. Okay. Here is looking at a bunch of Western European countries: France, Italy, Sweden, USA, Germany, Japan. Western European and other countries such as USA and Japan. This is looking at unemployment rates. Okay. This is from the book by Wolfgang Streeck, all right, or an article. I actually forget what exactly I'm citing. I'm sure you can find it if you look it up. But that's from work by, I think that's his New Left Review article, I think. And basically, so what you see is unemployment from the 1970s onward. Unemployment is generally on a kind of uphill incline in many countries around the world. Okay, but inflation is on a decline. Okay, so you may or may not know from your basic economics classes, if you took them, that in general kind of economic knowledge, there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay, generally policymakers can kind of choose which one they want a little bit more or less of. But if you want to keep unemployment down very low, you want to make sure everyone has jobs. You kind of have to accept relatively higher levels of inflation. Okay, but if you want to keep inflation low, then you have to accept some unemployment, okay? Now, the reason that this is important is because this is a question that is very much, it reflects class conflict, basically. And why is that? It's because if you have capital, if you're like a wealthy capitalist, your main priority is to keep inflation low, okay? If you're a worker or a poor person, you don't care that much about inflation. One, because you don't have that much money, so inflation is not going to hurt you that much because you're not going to lose that much value because you don't have that much value. But the other reason why, as a poor and working person, you don't care about inflation is because you might have debt. And if you have debt, inflation is actually a way to decrease your debt. So that's, right, because if I owe you 10 pounds, right, but the value of 10 pounds in a week is less than it is today, then in a week I actually owe you less than I do today. So inflation helps poor people, basically, relative to rich people. Rich people suffer more from inflation. So generally, the class interest of wealthy folks is to keep inflation as low as possible. All right, and poor and working people care much more about employment. They need some kind of basic job. That's what matters most to them to make their wages. Okay, so that's a little background economic knowledge for you to know. So that's why this is important. What you see from the 1970s onward is a kind of trade-off where countries such as the UK, US, Western Europe, Japan, whatever, start to tolerate unemployment, but they start to not tolerate inflation. So what this reflects is shifting kind of class power, basically, where the economic policies of many countries around the world start to reflect more the interests of wealthy people and less the interests of poor people, okay? And, to this day, like our central banks, for the most part, they care way more about keeping inflation low than they do about employment. In the 50s and 60s in the UK and the US, it was taken for granted that maintaining employment was like a national priority. Nowadays, we almost don't even talk about maintaining employment as a policy. For the most part, central bankers today only care about keeping inflation low, for the most part, as a priority. Okay, and that reflects kind of the shifting class interests that have occurred over the past several decades. Okay, so that's a little bit more detail on what we're talking about with neoliberalism. You also see things like billionaires increasing around the world, right? So there's a kind of, within countries, economic inequality has actually decreased, for a while over the past, century, probably, I think it's fair to say, because, the poorest countries are seeing growth, right? Like China, India, they're growing, right? So the difference between India and the US as country differences is kind of compressing. But if you just look at global inequality, like all the money in the world and all the people in the world, inequality has been increasing at the global level, just like it's been increasing kind of in the US and the UK. And this is indicated by like the proportion of the global wealth held by billionaires. Okay, so that's been increasing over time. Go back over to this one. Another key marker that you see of economic change that you see in the 80s in particular is top income tax rates. So how much money like super rich people pay to the public good. It decreases right around this time of the 1980s, right? So this is Thatcher, this is Reagan, right? They're famous for when they get into power, they cut taxes on the wealthiest people. Okay. Again, this graph shows you that in this period from like the 40s to the late 70s even, the wealthy people paid a lot of money to support public goods. In 1980s, there's this significant move in a bunch of countries. This is just a few: U.S., U.K., Germany, France. You see across countries there is a kind of a shift in multiple variables reflecting an increased kind of power of or let's just say there's clear evidence in multiple variables in multiple countries that economic policy starts to benefit the rich much more than the previous decades. Okay, that's generally the empirical reality that people call neoliberalism. Now, the big question, of course, is what is going on here. Okay, in the typical kind of left-wing narrative, the kind of simple-minded left-wing narrative is that some bad people on the right take power, and they just want to kind of reward their cronies. So the blame falls on people like Reagan and Thatcher. This is kind of like the left-wing narrative. It's because bad, wealthy people got together and they organized and they implemented policies They didn't need to implement those policies. They just did that. They implemented those policies to screw over the poor people and the working people. That's obviously that's a kind of very naive, simplistic way of putting it. Lots of smart people think something like that. I'm not belittling that, and there are ways of making that argument with great sophistication. So there's a lot to be said for that argument. But that's, I think, the basic kind of left-wing narrative of what's going on here. Okay. Well, one thing that's problematic about that argument is that if you look at other variables, such as the social liberalism variables, the right-wing reaction is not like completely taking over. Okay, there are these significantly and gradually and sustainably increasing kind of left-wing tendencies, also, particularly in social liberalism. And Reagan and Thatcher don't stop that. Okay, so the idea of a kind of generalized right-wing takeover doesn't seem so real. Also, if you think about the one of the data points we talked before about the association between microcomputers and skill bias and income inequality, there's a pretty tight match between the introduction of microcomputers and the actual spread of inequality. So an alternative explanation for neoliberalism, in other words, is it's not that some visionary right-wing people get together and decide to change policy in all these countries. I mean, if you think about it, that kind of isn't that convincing because it happens in multiple countries. In my view, that's something that I've told you folks, I'm basically kind of a lefty person. But something I've never quite been able to believe or understand is how, if neoliberalism and all these changes that are happening in the 1980s, if it's really just because like some bad right-wing people decided to engage in class war to shift power away from poor and working people, well, why did it happen in so many countries around the same time? That unless they're all like talking to each other and they have like a secret international like communication network where they're like planning these things together. To me, the kind of the geographical spread of these changes, the generalized kind of tendency for these things to be happening around the early 1980s, to me that speaks against the interpretation that this is just like some right-wing people deciding to take power or something. To me, that it points to there must be something deeper going on. Okay, and I think skill bias technological change isn't the whole story, but it gives you an alternative view of things that I think is a little bit more believable, which is basically pointing to the idea, as I've been basically sketching up until now, that at the bottom of this is technological changes, in which case people like Reagan and Thatcher are not the causes of neoliberalism, but they are more like the effects of neoliberalism. So in my view, you see things like Reagan and Thatcher because of the deeper underlying techno-economic changes that ultimately lead them to electoral power. Okay, so what exactly are those changes, the techno-economic and kind of social implications that produce people like Reagan and Thatcher? To me, that's where the action is. That's where the interesting answers will be found. Why do you see these policies all happening at the same time through these reactionary types of figures such as Reagan and Thatcher? That's what I'll try to talk about in a minute. But for the most part, you can think of neoliberalism as national policy making gets captured by global economic elites for whom national democracy no longer means anything. Okay, so another kind of point here that is necessary to understand is that economic globalization, basically the capacity for economic actors to do things across borders, whether it be to buy and sell goods and services, international trade, to invest in foreign countries, but also to set up factories and employ people in in your corporation in one country, to be able to set up factories and employ people in other countries, to globally distribute the different parts of your enterprise, the ability to ship things rapidly, the ability to communicate things rapidly. Economic globalization is directly a product of information technological advancements. We've talked about things like the transatlantic telephone cables. You only get that in like the 1950s as a kind of direct output of the information revolution. Obviously, cellular, communication technology, digital, all these things, the internet, obviously, ultimately, all these things the globalization of economic processes is pretty directly made possible by the information revolution and its implications. So I think there's a very direct connection there between the information revolution and the general capacity, in other words, for really, really rich people to expand their enterprises into a global way. And the reason that matters so much is because it means that economic elites are no longer tied down to the people in their country. So, in the 50s, when it was really quite hard to have like a truly global business, there weren't truly global businesses like we have today. If you're a wealthy elite, you're a CEO or whatever, and you're kind of grounded to your country. You're kind of obligated to care about your country because that's where your workers come from. That's where your buyers come from, right? You still see yourself as a citizen, even though you're super wealthy. What happens with economic globalization, and I submit to you that it is directly, in a kind of obvious way, empowered and made possible by the information revolution, is that super wealthy people within countries no longer give a shit about the people in those countries. The world is now their playground, and you can have consumers in one area and workers in another area, and not really care about either of them, and have your formal location for tax purposes in the Cayman Islands. You can have this kind of you can totally game it out so that you're making mega millions off of people around the world, both workers and consumers, and also you're untouchable by national governments, and they can't get your tax money. All of this, if you think about it, all of that is possible by changes that are introduced by information technology. All right, and this has serious implications because, you can see it in the data that capitalists basically are less reliant on the actual people in the countries that they come from. So here's a graph also from David Harvey's nice little book that shows precisely, it's a pretty significant change. It's pretty isolatable in time. It's around the 1980s that the amount of income, the amount of profit that is being made is suddenly substantially coming from foreign locales. Okay. So that gives you some. I hope that puts some some meat on the bones, if you will, of the kind of arguments that I've been making to kind of show you in the data records how some of these things play out and how they look. Okay. But now I want to talk to you about some of the more broad, what I've called kind of ethical or cultural changes that I think follow a similar pattern as skill bias technological change, but actually generalize not just to economic behavior and things like income and profits and the distribution of income, but to the basic ways that we think about the world and ourselves and the way we interact or don't interact. Okay? So for instance, to connect this a little bit more back to kind of the media, one finding is that I'm very interested in is from work by people such as Maria Petrova in her 2008 article that looks at the relationship between media freedom and income inequality. And she does a very sophisticated study and finds a fair bit of evidence for the idea that in countries where economic inequality is increasing, the wealthy are more likely to basically take over the media. And that you can think about that in a few different ways. In countries where the rule of law is weaker, it might be actual bribes, like when income inequality increases, like media owners can actually, the wealthy can actually bribe media to report on things the way they want to. In countries where the rule of law is stronger, such as the UK and the US, there's not much of that, obviously. But even in liberal countries such as the US or the UK, when inequality increases, it allows the wealthy to, in a fully legal way, exercise more power over media messages simply because they have more money. Okay, so if you look at the data, for instance, this is a graph from Maria Petrova's article. This just gives you a general look at country differences. Gini is a measure of inequality. That's on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you have media freedom. Okay, in general, you do see a negative relationship. Okay. So the more inequality, the less media freedom there is. That's in a cross-national sense true, as this graph shows. She also does more, sophisticated formal modeling and statistical testing, controlling for a bunch of other things. She finds that this relationship holds true. But also, she has like case studies of also in the U.S. and the U.K. So in the U.S., for instance, have you ever heard of the death tax? So historically there was always a tax on, like, if you die and you pass on, let's say you have a big inheritance, let's say you have $1 million you want to pass on to your son or daughter, it's always been typical to tax that, just like any economic transaction. Okay, it's like basically an inheritance tax. In the 80s, I think it was in the 80s. I have to check the article, but one of Petrofa's little kind of case studies or vignettes is basically a marketing campaign that is put together by private, rich people, basically who don't want to pay this tax on the inheritances. They basically get together and they're like, okay, let's make a big campaign to demonize this pretty normal tax and let's whip people into opposition to this tax so that we can save more money for ourselves. And that's when it becomes the death tax. So now people to this day still call it the death tax. But that's like a propaganda. That's a propaganda piece. That's like obviously a symbolically, affectively charged term for it that is literally kind of launched into the national consciousness through basically an organized media campaign by rich people who don't want to pay that tax. Okay, so that's just one case study of how this can happen in even in liberal countries. The basic point is that as income inequality increases, the rich exercise more power over the media messages, simply because they have more resources. Okay, it's not bribing; it's just an implication, right? So again, it's very similar to skill-biased technological change. Basically, with neoliberalism and with these changes, what is happening is that techno-economic acceleration is basically allowing an elite or a relative minority of people to have far more power over all aspects of things, not just economically, but also things like the media, okay? And then those are related, right? So you can think about this as positive feedback also. If the wealthy are able to influence the media, then guess what? A country with a certain media culture that is generous and sympathetic to rich people is going to make the rich people even richer, right? Because they're cutting their own taxes, for instance, by generating these kind of propaganda campaigns against inheritance taxes, okay? So again, positive feedbacks you can see. Another example, though, would be media choice. It's a very interesting kind of domain for thinking about how these things play out, because work by people such as Marcus Pryor has found that as media choice increases, inequality in political knowledge and participation both also increase. Okay? So this is why, if you remember the graph I showed you looking at the rate of diffusion for traditional television and then cable television is so important, because, and this is why I talked about the golden age of television, in the 1950s and 60s, people had more or less one reference point for what was going on in the world. It was sort of their nightly news anchor, right? With cable television, that is when you get things like Fox News. The splitting of something like Fox News and CNN, that's cable, okay? And what that means is that from there, people's ability to kind of opt in to different worlds increases, okay? And that's not just important ideologically, like that is what gives us kind of the right-wing Looney Tunes and also the left-wing Looney Tunes living in their own worlds. But it has somewhat even more kind of problematic implications because it allows people who are really interested in politics, who are really paying attention, they're smart, they're sophisticated, and they want to play a role in shaping the trajectory of society and policy. Those people get even better at that because now they can watch the news. They can watch the news 24 hours a day, right? So the 24 news hour cycle, for instance. CNN, I think, was the very first in the U.S. to have 24-hour news. Okay. If you really like political information and you want to be an activist and change the world politically, you can just watch CNN all day and night. You can become a whiz. You can know everything going on in the government, everything going on in the news. You can become a master of that. If you want to, if your personality traits suit you to that, if your intelligence and sophistication suit you to that. Now, if you are not suited to that, maybe you have relatively low IQ, maybe you're just not interested in politics, or maybe, also totally possible and legitimate, you're a relatively disenfranchised person in a group that has been historically marginalized. Maybe you know, when cable TV pops up, if you've been in a historically marginalized group, maybe you just feel like politics is not for you. Maybe you have been oppressed and you have been forced to feel like political news is not your game or whatever, you know, whatever it might be. There are different reasons for why this might happen, but the point is there are many reasons why there are going to be inequalities in the uptake of political information and then the political behavior also, okay? And so while that might be good that some people can, you know, become specialists in political information and become really knowledgeable about politics, that's good, right? Sounds good, right? The problem is people who are not so good at that, or maybe have reasons for feeling disenfranchised or don't identify with it, whatever the case might be, they can also just watch cartoons all day, right? I mean, if you're just kind of lazy or something, or you don't like whatever the case might be. At the same time as people can specialize in watching CNN all the time, people can also, because of cable, they can also just watch cartoons the whole time. Okay, so that starts to tear the social fabric, just like skill bias technological change, just like the economic changes of neoliberalism we looked at. In terms of what we consume and how we even see the world, this stuff as human beings, we start getting spread apart and separated based on our skills, our temperament, our personality traits, and maybe even our historical experiences of society that might not be our fault, right? So this is just one little graph from Marcus Pryor's book on post-broadcast democracy. And this kind of just shows some of his evidence. So he does survey analyses and looks at, basically asks people like how much they watch of things like cable, internet, or whatever. Like I think he actually looks at if people have internet access or access to cable TV, because these things spread out at different times, right? So what he finds, and so on the x-axis there, relative entertainment preference, that's basically, he asks people, like, how much do you like cartoons and entertainment? And then he asks people, like, how much do you like politics and political information? And he has this kind of measure of relative entertainment preference, just represents basically how much people prefer entertainment over news and information, okay, as one kind of measure. And basically what this shows is what I was just saying, that basically, so if you only have traditional television, no cable or internet, that's no media access. Look at this black line. If you like entertainment more than information, it doesn't have an effect. Look, this black line is pretty flat. It's more or less flat. So what that means is it doesn't matter. In the old world, the golden age of broadcasting, it didn't really matter if you liked cartoons or politics because you had the same amount of information. Oh, and on the y-axis, I'm sorry, this is like amount of political knowledge or something like that. It's also behavior, participation, like deciding to turn out to vote. It looks the same, so you can think about them as interchangeable. The y-axis here is political knowledge or behavior, basically. In the old world of the golden age of broadcasting, your preference for entertainment, or the differences between people in terms of whether they like news or entertainment, it didn't affect how much information or knowledge people got about politics. And why is that? It's because you couldn't opt out. It's because everyone watched the same nightly news. Whether you're dumb or smart, engaged in politics or not engaged in politics, whether your personality is suited to it or not suited to it, whether you're a marginalized person or not marginalized person, everyone more or less watched the nightly news. So everyone had more or less the same amount of information and knowledge about politics in the 50s and 60s. But when you look at people who have access to cable television and then the internet, look at these dotted or dashed lines, the relationship between entertainment preference and information, or knowledge, I should say, and behavior and participation, that is, the relationship becomes negative. So that for people who have cable and internet, if you love cartoons and hate politics news, then you're going to have less political knowledge than most people. And you're going to be less likely to vote than most people. Okay? So cable and internet, media choice, in other words, allows for this kind of tearing of the social fabric in which some people get really supercharged on politics, super informed, they're super smart, they vote a lot, they're activists, they're shaping the nature, the course of policy making. And then people who don't care about politics and just want to watch cartoons can just watch cartoons, and they drop out of the world of politics. They stop. They have much less knowledge about what's going on, and they're much less likely to participate. So they're not having an effect on things as much. Okay. So this is just another example of a kind of tearing of the social fabric that, again, because we're talking about, this is the difference between cable and internet versus traditional television. This is an outcome of the information revolution. This is one specific outcome of the information revolution developed in a particular field. In this case, this is a political science research we're looking at here. But it's a very similar, the shape of this pattern is very similar to skill bias technological change, isn't it? Because what it's all about is the information revolution basically separating people based on their skills and their experiences and their traits and putting them into fundamentally different pockets, okay? And the world is being shaped in that image, right? So if you connect this also to like the question of neoliberalism, when we looked at all these economic changes showing how, class power was shifting and the wealthy are getting wealthier and seem to be taking over, the economic policy of so many countries around the world from the 1980s. And you think, so you go back to this question, why is that? Is it really because people like Thatcher and Reagan just decided to kind of like steal power from the poor and working people? That seems kind of simplistic. I think much more compelling when you look at all of these trends together, such as this one, the sort of cultural changes that have a very similar shape. I think we're talking about a much deeper type of phenomenon in which fundamental, massive, and rapid changes in our very most basic abilities to manipulate and transmit information are playing out in multiple domains in a similar way, in which certain types of people are benefiting tremendously and being given more power, namely those who are instrumental, those who are able to use these technologies to promote their own power. They're organically increasing their own power and coming to control things simply because they have the traits and the skills that suit them to that. Whereas the people who don't have that are falling behind in every dimension, okay? Both in terms of media and information, knowledge and behavior and income, okay? Now, I have just a minute right before you leave. Don't pack up quite yet. I promise to let you go. Yeah, in just a minute, so I won't try to do this too much now. But I'll finish up, and I'll finish up these. I just have 2 slides left. I'll finish them up next time. But the basic reason why I think that this is not just about winners and losers. It's about our society actually becoming a much worse place, not only for poor and working people, but even also for rich people. Because basically, what I think happens because through all of these changes is that the actual nature of society becomes increasingly inhuman. It becomes increasingly alienating, even for the people who are benefiting the most, and it becomes increasingly a kind of alien world in which people are, the most basic capacity for us to even understand each other and where we're at and to have a sense of our own selves and our own lives and our larger place in the universe. This is actually, for all people, this is becoming more and more out of reach, because what's happening, and what I think is basically going on underneath all of these changes, is that our most basic human capacities to think about what matters to us and what we value and what actually we want to do with our lives, people in general are losing that through all of these same kind of dynamics that I'm showing you. So people are getting really good at making money. A small number of people are making a lot of money, but all of us are basically becoming worse at everything else, like thinking critically about society, thinking critically about ourselves, thinking honestly about what we really want and how we want to spend our lives, what our lives mean and what we're really fighting for. We all get much worse at those types of questions, and that's why I'm interested in larger questions in like public opinion, like looking at what people actually think about things is kind of the next part of this story, because you see things like people's willingness to question kind of the status quo, to think outside of like the current kind of systems that we live in. People's capacity to kind of question that or think outside of that seems to be decreasing over time, and people's tendencies to engage in activities that are militant and kind of deep forms of like courageous opposition, even things like, so here I'm looking at things like guerrilla warfare and rioting versus demonstrations and strikes. Basically what happens to all of human beings is we all kind of become soft. We become unwilling to kind of take a stand against anything in some sense. We become infinitely pliable, is what I would argue, as a result of all of this. And I think that's something that basically hurts everyone. All right, and I'll try to expound on that a little bit more next time. Thank you, everyone.